Hey everybody, Professor Anderson here, and it is Activity-Based Costing Day. I'm not entirely sure why they call this chapter Activity-Based Costing, because there's two other methods we have to learn before we even start talking about activity-based costing. But in general, let's talk about what this chapter is covering. This chapter is covering factory overhead. Direct materials, direct labor, they get allocated to jobs directly, as you've seen, or they get allocated in process costing, kind of directly. But factory overhead is something that we're going to spend a little bit more time on talking about how a couple of different methodologies to allocate those costs to the work that you're doing. Okay, so here we go, product costing allocation methods. That's pretty much the entire chapter. And all we're really talking about is factory overhead in the different ways that we're going to use to include them in product costs. Okay, so there we go. All right, so I snagged a couple of cute little graphics that I thought were good from the chapter. So this is the first one, right? We are talking about factory overhead cost, and you have to decide on an allocation method. So we're going to go through all three of these. We've got the single plant-wide method, the multiple production department rate method, and then finally the activity-based costing method. All right, in all of these, it's direct material, direct labor, factory overhead. None of that changes, right? That's the product costs, direct material, direct labor, factory overhead. And then we're not even worrying about what is factory overhead. We've kind of already covered that in previous chapters, but what we're really talking about is how do we decide how much factory overhead goes to each product that we're making. Okay, so we're going to move on down. The first one we're talking about, as I said, is the single plant-wide factory overhead rate method. Okay, so we're hitting that guy first. It's easy. It's easy to calculate. That's why we like this one, but it is misleading. And you're going to see that as we go through the example, because the idea is if you're making one product, then that's fine. Single plant wide, way to go. Super easy. But not too many businesses are making one thing. They're making multiple products. And if that's the case, you can't assign the product cost to all of them equally because some require more factory overhead than others. So if you remember, things with factory overhead are going to be things like, let's say, depreciation on equipment. What if something you're making is entirely handmade and requires only a little bit of factory overhead, but something else is entirely machine processed? That's going to require a lot of factory overhead costs. But if you're treating them as kind of the same product in the way you allocate them, then you would be treating them incorrectly. You would have too much factory overhead applied to the product that is more handmade, and maybe not enough factory overhead applied to the product that is machine made. Okay, so there's a whole good example on this in your chapter with snowmobiles and something else, lawnmowers, I think, and they go into this in a lot of detail. So if you follow that example through, I mean, I'm not going through that example, but that is the example that's through the entire chapter, is this snowmobile lawnmower one. You can see how the product costs can be misleading with that one. Okay, so anyway, let's get into the examples that we are going to cover today. The formula for this is going to be total budgeted factory overhead and over the total budgeted plant-wide allocation base, which sounds like a lot, but really we're just saying the total factory overhead that we estimate for the year divided by what we're going to be using as our allocation. So whether that's direct labor hours, direct labor dollars, machine hours, whatever our denominator is, that's our allocate. Whatever we decide makes the most sense for our product, that's going to be our allocation base. All right, so I'm going to scroll down here. Now, keep in mind, this is budgeted, right? I mean, there's a lot of room for error, but it's better that we estimate rather than have no calculation at all. All right, so this is for the single one. So here's our easier example. All right, we're going to get to a more complicated example in a second. Single plant-wide factory overhead rate. So I'm going to scroll up a little bit. Franklin Manufacturing uses 2 production departments to make its products. The budgeted overhead costs for the current year listed below. Franklin applies overhead costs to products based on direct labor hours. Okay, so we're using the same allocation base, which is direct labor hours, using the single plant-wide overhead rate. Great. Okay, so we've got 2 departments here making our product. Whatever they are, it doesn't matter. You've got 160,000 of factory overhead in one, 340 in the other. So we've got a lot more factory overhead happening in the second process. And for whatever reason that might be, it might be they require, like I said, more machine time or something like that. And that's, depreciation on equipment, that's factory overhead. Okay, budgeted direct labor hours, 12,000 for production 1, 8,000 for number 2. And that kind of jives with what I just said, that maybe there's less direct labor in the second one. Maybe it's more automated for the second part of the process, meaning making it have more overhead, right? So there are less hours working in production department 1 than, or production department 2 than production department 1. Okay, So let me get into this. What is their single? We're only doing one. We're calculating one rate. One. What is the single plant-wide factory overhead rate? Now, to remind you, the formula is total factory overhead over total budgeted allocation base, right? So total factory overhead, we're going to add those two guys together, over direct labor hours, total direct labor hours. So here's the formula here. You've got, oops, there we go. All of the factory overhead, 500,000, sorry, not rounding right, over 20,000 direct labor hours. And that comes out to a plant-wide rate of $25 per hour. Great. Solved, right? That's going to be our rate. So the idea is if a job takes 1 hour, it's going to get $25 of factory overhead applied to it. If a job takes 2 hours, it'll have $50. If it takes 10 hours, it'll have $250 worth of factory overhead applied to it, okay? So however long that job takes for direct labor hours is how much you're going to multiply that times 25, and that's going to be how much factory overhead you allocate to them. So in this example, it says, what factory overhead cost would be allocated to a product that uses 2 hours in production department 1 and 3 hours in department 2? Well, we're not distinguishing between department 1 and department 2. That as far as we're concerned, if it gets worked on and it's a direct labor hour, it's $25 an hour. So we've got 5 hours, $25 an hour. They're going to get $125 in allocated factory overhead. Simple. All right? Simple in the sense of it's one calculation, one rate, and we multiply it by how many direct labor hours there are. Done. Okay, so I'm going to get to the second more complicated example. It's not like super complicated. It's still the single allocation rate. Ooh, well, I'm kind of giving you the answers on the screen. Sorry. I don't want to pull it off the screen, but follow through it with me, okay? So Wake Company allocates factory overhead, same thing, single plant-wide overhead rate based on direct labor hours, same concept. The company estimates that factory overhead costs will be $60,000. Okay, so that's our estimated factory overhead. So there's our budgeted factory overhead cost, $60,000. I've got it here. And direct labor costs are estimated to be $123,750. But we're using not dollars, we're using hours. So right now we've got labor hours. So we've got to turn around and make that into the hours. If the total direct labor costs are $123,750, we'd have to look at what our employees are being paid. Oh, next sentence. Employees are paid $8.25 an hour. So we're going to take that $123,750, the direct labor dollars, divided by $8.25 an hour to come up with 15,000 hours. Okay, so we're estimating, the company's estimating that 15,000 direct labor hours are going to be worked throughout the year. And because we're doing this all based on the annual budgeted numbers, that's what we're going to use. So we've got 60,000 as our numerator, 15,000 hours is our denominator. That comes out to $4 an hour. So for every hour a job is worked on, they get $4 of factory overhead allocated to them. Okay, so now take it into the second step. Determine the factory overhead allocated to each product line. Well, we've got 2 product lines. We're making coffee here. We're going to be making standard coffee and deluxe coffee. Okay. Now, the standard coffee, we have to see how many hours are being worked on the standard coffee. It says there's 7,500 units of the standard coffee. Okay, we're not worried about that because we care about how many hours. The company requires 6,275 direct labor hours. That's what I care about. For every hour standard coffee is worked on, it gets $4 of overhead. So 6,275 hours at $4 of factory overhead, they get $25,100 of factory overhead allocated to standard coffee. Deluxe coffee, 10,200 units. Again, I don't really care about units at this point. I will in a second, but not yet. 10,200 units of deluxe coffee requires 8,400 hours. Okay, so 8,400 hours at a rate of $4 an hour of factory overhead. And that comes out to be 33,600 of factory overhead being allocated to it. Great. Okay, so now we know standard coffee gets 2,500, 25,100. Deluxe gets 33,600. Kind of makes sense based on their names, right? Deluxe gets a little bit more harder to make, longer to roast. I don't know. So that's it for B. C asks, what is the factory overhead allocated to each unit of standard coffee and each unit of deluxe coffee? Okay, so now I do care about how many I made. So the idea is, if standard coffee has $25,100 of factory overhead allocated to it, how much is for just one? how much factory overhead is going to just one unit of coffee? So we're going to look at, we have $25,100 of factory overhead, and we're going to divide it by how many that we made. We made 7,500 units of standard coffee. So here we go, last little bit. 25,100 was the total factory overhead allocated to it, divided by the 7,500 units that we made, tells me that each unit, I don't know, container of coffee has $3.35 of factory overhead allocated to it. That's important. That's important because you need to know how to cost your product for sale, right? You've got direct materials, you know what direct materials are, presumably. Direct labor, you know what that's going to be. Well, factory overhead, though, we've got to add that into our product costs so that we know how much added together, how much to sell our standard coffee for. Okay, deluxe unit, well, we had $33,600 of factory overhead. And how many do we make? Remember, we're finding out how much for just one. So 33,600 divided by 10,200 units of deluxe coffee comes out to $3.29. So actually, it costs more to make the deluxe coffee, but we can make more of it. Okay, so it winds up being that they get allocated a lower factory overhead cost. All right, so that's follow me for part 2. Not follow me. I sound like a YouTuber, like a real one. Part 2, we're going to go into the multiple. Okay, so I'm going to pause, end it here, pick up number 2 in a second.